You've set this up nicely so that Lainey is actually the first presenter. As she noted, she's a cooperative extension specialist working in Northwestern California, and she will be talking about fire ecology basics. We thought, and this was a great idea, for those of us who aren't scientists, people on our organizing committee realized that we're going to be talking about a lot of fire ecology principles that the public might not be have that much facility with. And so Lainey's going to spend about 20 minutes talking to you a little bit about fire ecology and fire management topics.
Yep.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Great. I have to say, the first red flag I had about this planning committee was when they asked me to give this talk. How could I give this talk in a room with Scott Stevens and Hugh Safford and John Keeley sitting in the audience? But no, I'm just joking. I'm really happy to be here and honored to be able to give this talk. I am an extension advisor, and so that means we're kind of good at taking complicated topics and hopefully making them digestible and available to lots of diverse people. And as we see, this audience is full of different types of folks. So thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm going to cover the kind of fire ecology basics. You might be thinking this is just a pretty picture, but I actually chose this photo as my cover slide for a very specific reason. This is a lupin bloom in the Bald Hills of Redwood National Park. And that's an area that's burned frequently with prescribed fire. They have these deciduous oak woodlands on kind of a 3 to 5 year burn cycle with prescribed burning. And what they found is that 2 years after fire, they get these incredible lupin blooms. And the local community comes out and people kind of pay attention to when different burn units are being treated because they want to catch these lupin blooms. And I think it's a great illustration of the fact that so many of our beloved ecosystems in California have a fire story that we may not know or see every day, but it's there. And fire ecology is really the study of those interactions and the dynamics that make this happen. And so it's always behind the scenes in California. And really, I think, so Stephen Pine is a fire historian, and he wrote in his recent book called California, a Fire Survey. It's all about fire in California. And he said that 54% of ecosystems in California are fire dependent. And most of the rest, with only just a few exceptions, are fire adapted. So we know this as California residents, that we live in a state that's got fire all over the place, and most of our ecosystems and plant communities are really tied to fire in some way. For this talk, we're spending the next 3 days talking about fire, and like Hugh said, we're gonna be throwing terms like fire dependent and fire adapted. You'll just be hearing those. And so this talk is really about defining some of those terms, wrapping our minds around what these different topics mean and what the terminology is, and getting us all on the same page so that for the next 3 days, we just kind of know what we're talking about when we hear those words. So let's start with thinking about fire dependent and what that means. I think fire dependent and fire adapted are often used interchangeably, but they actually mean quite different things. So fire dependent means actually something that requires fire in order to persist. And if we trust Stephen Pine and his 54% of California ecosystems are fire dependent, that's pretty incredible, right? I actually don't know where he got that number, but I think I trust him. A good example of this, and the photo you see there, are giant sequoia, which is one of our beloved ecosystems in California. And these forests require fire. They need fire in order to regenerate. And in the mid-20th century, people were wondering why they weren't seeing giant sequoia regenerating. They just weren't seeing young ones come up. And there was some research that was done kind of experimenting with prescribed fire in those stands. And they realized that those stands need fire. They need frequent fire in order to give a mineral soil for a seed bed and to allow giant sequoia to regenerate. And so prescribed fire has become a huge component of management in giant sequoia. And it's a good example of a species that really requires fire, needs it. Now, fire adapted is a little different. Fire adapted really means that it's something that has evolved to survive and persist with fire. Doesn't necessarily need it or require it, but has evolved traits that allow it to survive. So a good example, and what I have there is Douglas fir, which is something we're all familiar with. We see it all the time, and that's a tree that doesn't necessarily need fire for its physiological function, but it certainly is adapted to survive fire. And once it gets even 10 years old, it's able to withstand some pretty good fire. And that's because it has evolved traits like thick bark and it self-prunes. And so there are some of these traits. It doesn't resprout, but another example of an adaptation would be resprouting after fire, like oaks do and like lots of shrubs do. So that's fire adapted, different than fire dependent. Some other terms I think that we hear a lot that we think, we often hear used interchangeably are fire intensity and fire severity. And again, these are very different ideas, actually. They relate to one another, but they are not the same. So fire intensity is really about the amount of energy and heat that's being put out by a fire at kind of a per unit. It's a really kind of fine scale idea of the intensity of the fire where it's burning. Fire severity is really about the impact that that fire is having on an ecosystem. So what are the ecological impacts of the fire? And those things are not, sometimes they're linked, sometimes, high intensity is high severity, but not always. So this is an example from the Southeast United States. It's a longleaf pine. And this is a species that can handle high intensity fire, and it's not high severity. They have the young longleaf pine they call it a grass stage. And the young ones can withstand a lot of fire and just survive. And then eventually they've stored up enough energy and they just shoot up and grow tall. So that's an example of high intensity fire not being high severity, because it does not have a severe impact on the vegetation community that it's burning in. Now, on the other side, you can have low intensity fire that is not low severity. And this is an example of an issue that maybe many of you have heard of, but when you're trying to bring fire back into a pine forest, longleaf pine, or in that case on the left, that's a ponderosa pine, often after years of fire suppression, build up those big duff mounds from the shedding of the bark, and the roots grow into those. And so when early restorationists were trying to bring fire back into those old growth forests, they were using low intensity fire to burn in there. But the problem they were having is that those duff mounds would ignite and would sit and smolder, and were actually killing the biggest trees, the trees that they were trying, to protect. And so that's an example of low intensity fire being high severity. So those two terms are really different, and we need to watch how we use them and understand what we mean when we say intensity and severity. Now with fire severity, I think most of you, have a good sense of low severity, high severity. Low severity fires, where generally most of the mature vegetation remains intact after a fire. Moderate severity is where it's a little more patchy, maybe, kind of moderate impacts on the mature vegetation, but you definitely have a lot of survival. And then high severity is where we see most of the small vegetation being completely consumed and high mortality in the mature vegetation. And this is an example, of course, from a forest ecosystem. Those concepts of severity differ depending on what kind of vegetation community you're talking about. But it's just kind of nice to wrap our minds around what we mean by low, moderate, and high severity. And I'm talking here about vegetation severity. There's also soil burn severity is something that you'll hear fire people talk about, and that's really about the impact to the soil. And I'm not going to go into detail on that today. This is a fire severity map. I'm sure many of you have seen these before. They tend to come out during a fire or right after a fire for us to kind of understand what the impacts were. This is the Angora fire, just an example. So this is the Tahoe area. And the red is usually mapped as the high severity area, and then green and yellow for low and moderate severity. So these maps are always just really helpful to kind of get an understanding of that patchwork of severity and what we see in a fire. And the Angora fire had quite a lot of high severity. So another concept in fire ecology that we talk about a lot, and I'll be followed by Scott Stevens, who's going to go in depth on fire regimes. But the fire regime is a concept that we use all the time in helping us understand the relationship of a certain habitat or ecosystem type to fire. And so it's really kind of the long-term fire patterns that are characteristic of an ecosystem. And we use it to make a generalized description of the role of fire in that ecosystem. I really like this, this figure because it captures a lot of what we, in the fire science world, kind of the basics. And so we love triangles in fire. And we have all different kinds of triangles to describe different things. And kind of the most basic level, let me see if this, click on, oh, no, does that work? Yeah, right here. Is that working? Okay. So the fire triangle is kind of the most basic of our favorite triangles in fire. And it describes at the most kind of minute level what fire needs to burn, right? So heat, oxygen, and fuel. These are the building blocks of fire at this really fine scale. Now, as we move up to kind of more of a stand level scale, a fire scale, and you'll see on the x-axis there, the days, we're kind of moving up in time. There's the fire behavior triangle. Now, the fire behavior triangle really talks about how fires burn, right? So weather, topography, and fuel, these are the things that dictate how a fire is going to burn on that kind of mid-level scale, the stand scale, the wildfire scale. And then we have the fire regime. And I really like this figure because it shows that the fire regime is capturing things at a much broader scale. So both in space, it's at the regional level, it's at the decade to century level, it's incorporating climate, vegetation patterns, ignition patterns. All of these kind of larger concepts really dictate how a fire regime is shaped for a certain forest or a certain woodland or habitat type. So I think this is really useful just for understanding how those different contexts fit together. And fire regimes have we kind of 7 characteristics of fire regimes that we think about when we're trying to characterize an area. And the first one, they're really temporal component to fire regimes, right? The seasonality of fire, the fire return interval, which is, how often is fire on this landscape? And I have a couple pictures here that I think help illustrate that. The first one on the upper side there is a Medusa head burn that I helped orchestrate last summer. And this was a burn we did to try to control this invasive grass, Medusa head. It needs, if you're going to control it, it needs to be burned in the early summer, after it's gone to, it's right before it goes to seed or fully goes to seed, and everything else is dormant. So it's a late season grass. So seasonality for that one is critical. If you burn it at any other time of year, it's not going to have the effect that you want. So it's a really good example that certain habitats, fire has a role that's very seasonally based. The one on the bottom there is knobcone pine. Now this is a good one to illustrate the fire return interval. It is a species that burns at high severity. It has serotinous cones, that means they only open with fire, so it can only release its seed if it has mortality of the mature tree. So it's a really interesting, you'll see stands of it, and it'll burn, it burns at high severity, all the trees are killed, and then you just see this flush of young ones. And so for it doesn't want frequent fire. It's not adapted to frequent fire. It needs infrequent, high severity fire in order to persist. So that fire return interval for the knobcone pine is very critical, that it's not too, if you burned that really frequently for a long time, you'd see it go away. So those are kind of good illustrations of the temporal aspects of the fire regime. The spatial aspects are also important when we think about fire regimes. So this can be the size of the fire, but also the spatial complexity of the way it burns. So here again, I have 2 examples of fire severity maps, which we know the red is the high severity, and then the other colors show the other levels of severity. The one on the right is the moonlight fire. And this is kind of used often as an example of a fire that had really large patches of high severity, kind of unprecedented, huge patches of high severity. The one on the left is actually the Biscuit Fire, which was in Southern Oregon. And you can see it had a lot more complexity and kind of a patchwork at a finer scale. There's definitely high severity in there. In fact, a lot of that was in knobcone pine, but it's a lot more patchy. So the spatial complexity idea is a big part of the fire regime. And then, of course, there's the magnitude. So the intensity, the severity, the fire type, which means, was it a crown fire where it was actually burning through the canopy of the trees? Or was it a ground fire, a surface fire? So we've already talked a little bit about intensity and severity, but those are other really key components of the fire regime. And often when we map fire regimes, so this is a map that's based on land fire data. It's a data source that we often use in fire. These are different fire regimes, and I'll talk you through them. But kind of the two main things that we really look at for the fire regime in this kind of context are, the frequency of fire and the severity of fire. So you'll see here the light pink. Yeah, it's showing up the same. The light pink, which includes most of California and definitely most of Northern California, is mapped as a fire regime that pre-European settlement was less than 35-year fire return interval. So we were seeing fire at less than 35 years, low to moderate severity. So that feels right for a lot of the areas that we live and work in. The red is also less than 35-year fire return interval, but at high severity. And that's a lot of the Great Plains and grasslands that when they burn, they burn at high severity, and all the mature vegetation is killed, and then it comes back and it's adapted to that. So these kinds of maps are really useful. I like this one, and it shows kind of the percent of the United States there in that little pie chart that was adapted to those different major fire regime groups. So what determines these long-term fire patterns? What are the things that feed into the fire regime? And there are kind of four major categories: that climate and weather patterns, ignition sources, so how do these fires actually start, vegetation, so there are a lot of characteristics of the vegetation that dictate the fire regime and really feed into that, and then landscape characteristics, so topography and large bodies of water, things like that influence the way that fires burn. And one of the things that I personally find really interesting is, on the vegetation category, is flammability. And leaf litter, when you have like in an oak, have you ever walked through an oak in a dry period in the winter and just heard those oak leaves crunching under your feet? And you start picking up these clues about the fire regimes of the different ecosystems that you're familiar with, right? Whenever I go anywhere, I kind of stand and pick up things and think, like, what was the role of fire in this place? I'm always trying to figure it out. And one that I think is really fun to think about is redwood. So when you go into a redwood forest and you think, this is a wet coastal forest, there must be no role for fire in here. Then you start looking around and they have these long leaves. The redwood leaves are long and they're real lofted, and they make these fluffy beds, and they dry out pretty quickly. And then you look at the boles of the trees, the stems of the trees have these big fire scars. And then you look and you see a tree that, that got injured and it has all these resprouts. Those are fire adapted trees. The redwood forest is actually very set up for fire. It has all these adaptations. And then you start looking at some fire history studies and you realize that redwood a lot of areas had pretty frequent fire. So I just urge you, I think, through this talk to think about when, seeing things through the lens of fire, and what's the role of fire and how has it shaped these landscapes that we are really familiar with, but we don't always see them through that fire lens. But then the other thing, I think, in this whole conversation is I've forgotten a major piece of fire regimes. And it's something that when I'm reading up on fire regimes, I'm not seeing it mentioned, and that's humans. So humans are a huge part of fire regimes. We have chosen how to manage certain landscapes for millennia, and we've been an active part of owning fire, for better or for worse, in California and throughout the world. Thank you. And one paper that came out a couple of years ago, in late 2016, Scott was on it, a couple other folks, was this paper that really showed this connection between humans and fire regimes. So what these guys did, it was a group of scientists, and they really wanted to look at the connection between fire regimes and climate patterns. That's what they set out to do. So they gathered all these data that they had been collecting through various studies for years and started analyzing it for looking at climate patterns. And they just weren't seeing what they thought they might see. Scott can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but kind of just not picking up some of the patterns that they thought they might see. What they started to realize is that the major shifts in fire regimes in the Sierra Nevada, this study was for the Sierra Nevada, were linked with major changes in human management and human settlement patterns. So they could see the signal of the Native American period. They could see the signal of massive grazing in the Sierra Nevada. They could see the modern suppression era really clearly mapped out in the dendrochronological data that they were using to do this study. And so they actually wrote a paper called Socio-Ecological Transitions Trigger Fire Regime Shifts and Modulate Fire-Climate Interactions in the Sierra Nevada. And what they really found was in the periods where they had the most active management and engagement with the human communities in the Sierra Nevada were the time periods when climate had the least effect. I find that to be a very hopeful message and something that we should all take with us in these next couple days as we think about our role. And that you know, we have a place, and we've long been a part of managing fire and using fire, and we're part of the fire regime. So anyway, that's all I have, and I hope I give you a good little, that's my little guy, he loves fire. But thank you.